Last night, Governor Mills outlined her biennial budget to the legislature. Included in the $11.6 billion budget is a proposal to increase the cigarette tax. Today, the American Lung Association released its annual State of Tobacco Control report, which calls on the legislature to ensure the tax remains in the final budget package. As Alyssa Thurlow reports, they say the tax is a proven health strategy that is long overdue.
Thank goodness we're doing it now. It's about time.
It's been 20 years since Maine has increased its cigarette tax. In 2005, it went from $1 to $2. Governor Janet Mills is proposing a $1 increase to the cigarette tax in her budget for the next biennium.
A $1 increase for a total of $3, which puts us in the middle of our New England neighbors, which is still relatively low.
Mills told the legislature in her State of the Budget address she does not like proposing new taxes, but if she has to consider a revenue increase, it needs to be, quote, specific and purposeful rather than broad-based.
And I wanted to provide some social benefit in return. That's what the cigarette tax achieves.
Public health advocates we spoke with are applauding Mills' proposal, calling it one of the most effective ways to reduce smoking rates.
With a $1 tobacco increase, we would see about 3,200 people in the state of Maine who would likely quit smoking.
When we have seen tobacco taxes increase elsewhere, you do see an increase in people trying to make a quit attempt, and you do see that reduction in individuals who indeed use tobacco products.
Lance Bushy is with the American Lung Association. Their latest report gave Maine a C grade when it comes to tobacco taxes. He says an increase in the cigarette tax would not only save lives, but would also generate millions of dollars in revenue and reduce long-term related health care costs. According to the governor's office, this move could generate $80 million in revenue to the general fund over the next 2 years. Julia McDonald of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network in Maine believes this to be a nonpartisan issue.
I think there's very few people who wouldn't support less youth smoking and youth quitting smoking.
Maine legislative Republicans oppose the tax increase, saying Maine is already one of the highest tax states in the country. Senate Minority Leader Trey Stewart called the proposed tax increases a, quote, insult to the people of Maine, adding in a press conference following the State of the Budget address, saying, quote, we do not have a revenue problem in Maine. We have a spending problem, unquote. The legislature has until the end of the fiscal year to pass the budget. Reporting in studio, Alyssa Thurlow, WABI News.